So, hello, Rox, and I just had interesting discussion related to um, U.S. elections, and we actually touched upon topic of conflict, how conflicting information and the opinions of people can lead to division and confrontation, whereas conflict in itself doesn't need to go in that direction. Conflict actually can be a tool for the expansion and our ability to learn, to understand the other people point, and actually help ourselves to enhance our ability um, to comprehend.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, our relationship probably exemplifies that more for me than many have. And about how when we have conflict, um, we're able to stay with the conflict long enough in order to go to what you called the expansion, right? Like it's a willingness, because conflict can be uncomfortable, right? Like conflict can be it can trigger things in us. It can bring forward, as someone recently reminded me, our brain is a box of stories. And so how we like when we were talking a few minutes ago, you talked about your historic stories and how they influence how you see the world today. And that's so true for all of us, right? Like that our and so we go into conflict with all those stories raging, and we sometimes jump to erroneous conclusions. And that's what I liked about the conflict that you and I just experienced, or the discussion we just experienced. Notice I wanted to bring it down from conflict to discussion, but maybe it's because I'm in processing mode, and we just talked about how, when we can process it, that's when maybe we can find the lessons and the learning and the insights and the expansion that you talked about. But what I noticed is the need to understand each other. Like you'll recall how many times I asked you, just hold on, I'm not sure I understood what you said. And that was the most useful thing for me. And that's where I love your patience with that, because that's my MO, is always wanting to know, what is the other person really saying? Like, am I hearing it correctly? And to me, that's where the expansion happens. What do you think?
Well, exactly. And one thing that I would imagine, when it comes to the conflicting situation, that we go into corner of defending. We go into defense mode, and that's almost like survival mode. And like, I have to survive this conversation or this situation from my point, rather than opening up and saying, okay, this is not threatening, it's actually helping me out understand and reaching across the line, and not agreeing with another person is actually just for sake of avoiding the conflict, is actually beneficial for both sides. So letting people be authentic through expression of their opinions is a great service. So just because we think, or when we voice an opinion that is not popular, we should be able to do that, because we owe ourselves ability to express who we think we are at that given moment, because the whatever opinion we have might change a day from now or a year from now, because we are not constant categories.
Yeah. In addition to, it might change a year from now, we actually might have a clearer case of our own perspective too, because sometimes it doesn't change what we think, but it solidifies what we believe or think. Because I used to engage in debate in high school and university, and one of the things I remember debate teachers saying is, you need to know the other side well enough so that you can understand your own argument. And so you have to be open to hearing it, even though it might completely create cognitive dissonance in your own brain, which can be really difficult. But yeah, it allows you to strengthen your own convictions as well. You know, I was recently, I don't know if you've heard about the the Nexium
Yeah,
cult in
of course.
that,
Yeah.
that recently
Yeah.
went to court in New York City. And I was listening to some people. It was a documentary, and some people were challenging the quote unquote survivors. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that word, but the
Hmm.
survivors, and saying, oh, I would never get caught up in that. And I started thinking to myself, okay, I need to go inside I need to think about my own life. Would I ever, because I would have thought I would never get caught up in a cult like piece too, because of my cognitive capacity, right? Like,
Hmm.
talk about arrogance, right? And I mentioned that to my mother one day, and she 91-year-old mother, and she said, yeah, I think you might be susceptible to. And I said, Mom, what's that based on? And she said, you feel things passionately, and people who are willing to put their perspective out there are more vulnerable. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, that I felt like she was really kind of limiting my capacity, but I thought about it, and I reflected more, because I thought, man, I've got to think about, would I be vulnerable? Because I know that you need to understand your own biases if you're going to counter them. And I thought about a story from when I was 21 years old and in university, and I did have a situation where someone tried to manipulate me, and
Hmm.
it in the moment I couldn't see it.
Hmm.
And a really dear friend took me aside and said, I'm seeing this from outside, and I'm seeing what's
Hmm.
happening when you leave the room. And he's manipulating you because he sees you as a powerful woman, that if
Hmm.
he can do that, you're under his thumb.
Oh, wow.
And this friend was glorious in sharing this with me. And so once I saw what he saw, like, I rejected it first, like, absolutely, that's not happening to me, of all people, me. And as I processed it and I saw exactly what he was seeing, I went and challenged the person who did it, and that ended it all. Like, the guy ended it. There no more flirting, no more
Hmm.
trying to manipulate me. And only in reflection did I realize the beauty and power of that friend who brought me what I would say is the truth. He allowed me to see the truth because I couldn't see it. And so that did tell me my mom was right. But that very moment, in learning from it, actually helped me be less susceptible to it, because we all are very vulnerable, like, emotionally
Absolutely.
very vulnerable. And I recently called that friend, by the way, and thanked him. And he said, oh, I didn't do the work, you did the work. And I
Yeah.
said, yes, but you were the catalyst for me to see the truth so that I could then do the work.
Exactly, and that's the thing. He offered another perspective,
Yeah,
which you were not able to access at the moment.
yeah,
So, in a work situation, we all had that, where we were challenged within that environment, um, and asked why did we make certain decision or leading certain ways. And initial, I mean, almost automatic. I guess comment would be, again, to be defensive. But if you step back and look at that and say, okay, this person is actually helping me see, is watching my back, he's looking at my back, he's looking for my best interest, because he can see something I cannot. So turning around and having that discussion, and actually, I had a perfect example in work environment where I was challenged all the time by a certain person, and but I didn't disengage. I actually engaged even more. I wanted to hear, learn, and turned out we all wanted the same thing. It's just that his perspective was different than mine. But I took his perspective, included into my perspective, and I thanked him, and I I still thank him, and we ended up being actually friends. Whereas had I followed my instinctive and reaction, we would be in the two different corners of the ring. So going back, the conflict really has to be a tool of, sorry, tool of integration rather than tool of the escalation.
You know,
So,
you and I talk about integration, and I mentioned it to someone recently, and we had an interesting discussion, but they were really struggling, and I wasn't as clear in defining what that actually looks like. And so I know you've got a really good, that you have a clear understanding of what you mean by integration. So talk more about how you would turn conflict into this piece you call integration.
well, it's really understanding. There are two parties into this. One is your own ability to see and access
Hmm.
different viewpoints and make them your own. So that's that internal integration, and then integration in terms of welcoming the other party into environment that you both exist and making enough space in that environment for the two supposedly opposite opinion exist. And it goes back to what is the opposite? Are they actually opposite? Or I see them as a spectrum. I see them as a spectrum of light. It's not black and white. It's somewhere in between. It's not green or yellow. It's somewhere in between. So it's it starts with definition. Do we live in kind of dualistic world and having degree in the electrical engineering that reinforces plus minus and that
Yeah.
generates the flow of the energy, and that's fine. But in terms of human emotions, it's if we take that approach that's not opposite, and by being opposite we exclude it
Yeah.
from our ability, it may be just a different version of the opinion.
It's sort of like trying to find that third option. When you feel,
Yes,
the more you feel you're in conflict, the more if you're really trying to understand each other, you're finding that third option that may be uh, um, not a hybrid. Hybrid almost diminishes it, but it's an understanding that there's beauty and strength in both positions, and that if
exactly.
you can find that third option is
Yes,
sometimes is probably because it's integrated is stronger too.
right. I call it point of neutrality.
Yeah. Okay.
And so where two things can exist at the same time, it's quantum physics, isn't
Yep.
it?
Yep.
So the one doesn't exclude the other.
Yep.
It just is, and enjoying that beauty. I often think of how we tend to exclude stuff. At the same time, most of us are avid travelers and love to go to these exotic places to see new things. Yet, which is very different to our own environment. Yet, when it comes to everyday life, if something exists that is opposite of what we are used to, we kind of mix it. As not interesting, not, but the beauty is actually in that diversity.
Everywhere. Yep. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, and sometimes you can only, like, I know many times having visitors come to Toronto, they see things in Toronto that I haven't seen in a long time, because you're right. When you're too close to your own position, you can't see with us the same clarity as that person who sees things differently than you do. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the existence of quote unquote opposite or different doesn't negate your existence.
Yeah.
It just enhances that. So there is enough space in our capacity, in human capacity, to actually allow for all of that and learn from it and enjoy it. Eventually, learn how to enjoy it, if
It,
in some
it
cases.
yeah, because it sounds like what you're saying is the more you're willing to move closer to the opposite, the more likely you are to raise up to that third option, that ability to see differently.
Point of neutrality. That's very, very powerful place to be. That's where you stop engaging from that uh, point where you feel threatened
Yeah.
and fearful, and then you start to see it. It just expands your ability to see.
Yeah, so as you explained that, I love it. However, I have to say something like a word neutrality always seems bland to me. Like I'll have to think more about, I mean, because I know I'm someone who does not walk away, let alone run away from conflict. But I think it's the neutrality piece that um, just even calling it that is problematic for me because it feels bland. It feels like um, letting go of caring.
No, it's letting go of the attachments.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah. You still care, but you care from different point of view. You care. You don't. You see beauty in it, and you are welcome. It's like you're welcoming the. You see beauty in both sides. It's.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, and that's all it is. It's really loving the humanity at the end of the day, and accepting the humanity. And yeah, so I did early on at the beginning of this pandemic. I wrote a small piece on my LinkedIn um, profile. I'll share that one with you. The observation, the observer. I had a function on one of the projects, which we um, jokingly called Observer. And it really helped me to start to appreciate that position. So it's not, it's engaging. It's engaged. You're very engaged, but you see the stuff from a different, with expanded perspective. Let me put it that way. You kind of step out of the grind and see that uh, yeah, you're not inside, you're seeing from outside.
Yeah.
And that's that point of neutrality. So it actually goes well with the how you were physically describing the integration. You're actually sitting
Yeah. So
on
you
the
have
on the
perspective.
peak. Yeah, yeah, so you have bigger perspective.
So how do you, I know I'm kind of shifting this a little bit, but I know we talk in in the context of this a lot. How do you see this related to the feminine and masculine?
Well, they're seen as being separate and existing next to each other
Hmm.
rather than being um, mm, a pool of the attributes and traits and tools that each one has access to. So when you approach, let's say, conflicting situation, you can approach it strictly from the mental point of view and go into endless discussions based on the rationale and arguments and facts or
Right. And you're saying
non-facts.
that's the masculine, a
And that would
masculine
be a
approach.
masculine logical approach. And but when you add to that feminine approach, saying, okay, there is a compassionate part, and I see these arguments, as you just mentioned, we are coming from the personal stories and personal experiences, and this person is because this person has this argument and that argument, he or she is not bad person. It just that her or his experience formed that opinion. So you see that completeness of the personality, and you are able to empathize with the person for that reason. And then you come to that point of acceptance or resolution faster, because you're not just relying on one or the other. Or the other extreme would be if you're just compassionate and just feel sorry for that person forever, that he or she had that experience and poor that person came to all these wrong conclusions, not seeing the
And then,
validity
then
of
it's
their
not empathy. Yeah, then it's not empathy anymore. Then it's sympathy,
exactly,
and
exactly,
and
exactly,
which diminishes the person and that
exactly,
person's humanity. So
absolutely.
I
So
I hear you. So it's kind of like understanding that in conflict, The story is a driving factor, and also the capacity, because the moving up to that vantage point requires a dance between the story and the facts, the story and the critical thinking component. And I mean, I almost hate to put critical thinking in the area of the masculine, only because I think that diminishes the definition or the understanding of critical thinking. But I think we typically see critical thinking as masculine energy. The
It's a
you called that,
logical
yeah,
path.
which is only part of critical thinking, is my point. But yeah, that logical, linear kind of thing is more of a masculine tendency. Whereas the story, the narrative, is really what you talked about it earlier, is really what drives the way we see things. It really, and that's why advertisements use story, they use narrative, because our behavior, I think it was Ray Baumeister who said that everything we do is motivated by our need to belong, and stories define whether we belong or not. The stories we tell ourselves in our heads. I can't remember who said it recently. I heard it from Marsha Reynolds, but I'm not sure that it's her quote. But that our brain is essentially a box of stories, and it's how we process and come to understand them that determines how we see the world.
Exactly, that internal
Yeah.
dialogue or
Yeah.
monologue, whatever it is.
Yeah, which we see as being the feminine. And so again, what in this conversation is making sense to me is seeing those two as as married to each other, understanding the value of the critical thinking, the logical processing, and the power of the narrative coming together to in combination to gain perspective, is when conflict can become constructive.
Exactly. Not inclusive. Inclusive, not exclusive of the, so we can take bits and pieces from each perspective and actually come up with much better solution than
Yep.
each one. So we should actually invite that, whether we call it conflict or critical thinking or whatever name we give it to it, we should invite it with the intent to resolve it and learn from it.
Yeah, and yet most people spend all of their life trying to avoid conflict.
Oh, so much, so true. And actually that in itself, it stunts the growth of the person. It cannot grow.
That I totally agree. And I think I was mentioned when we were talking about bringing this topic to our discussion today, I mentioned that I think it's John Dewey, the philosopher, who talked about how it's not experience that teaches us, and I'm paraphrasing him now, it's not experience that teaches us, it's how we reflect on that experience. And so I think that that's our experience with conflict also is only able to teach us the full lesson if we're able and willing to reflect on it, which goes to that critical thinking component.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
See, we came to the perfect conclusion.
I'm not to conclusion. I'm always in discovery mode. So, and I know you are too.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
here's the thing. What I think before we close this conversation, I just want to say I think we need to talk more about conflict. Maybe there's another angle we can bring on it to a future conversation. I'm not sure what our plan will be next conversation, but before we started recording and since, I've really enjoyed
No,
our
absolutely.
conversation. And so thank you so much. By the way, she's Nermina, I'm Roxanne, and we are, these conversations are coming through an organization that Nermina started called FeMasCon. Anyway, thanks so much, Nermina. I'm gonna shut down the recording now.
Thank you, Roxanne.